our bodies have to conduct electricity, and salt is an electrolyte. And so because it conducts electricity. And so if our salt levels drop, all kinds of bad things start happening. Depression, nausea, being ornery. We know how important, we talk a lot about hydration and how important it is to drink water. But if you don't have salt with the water that you're drinking, you're flushing all of those electrolytes.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Hilda Labrada-Gore here, the host and producer of the show. Welcome. Nausea, headaches, depression, and more can be the result of a lack of salt in our diet. Wait, what? Yes, salt, a much maligned nutrient, is actually essential for good health. This is episode 311, and our guest today is Darryl Bosshardt. Darryl from Redmond's Real Salt is a salt expert, having studied salt and minerals his entire life. Today, he explains the importance of natural, well-sourced salt in the diet. He busts the myths that it causes high blood pressure. And he goes into how salt, one of the world's most prized foods, got its bad reputation in the first place. Finally, he shares simple steps to ditch the fake stuff and find the real salt that will nourish our bodies on multiple levels. Before we get into the conversation, join hands with us. Membership for podcast listeners is only $30 a year. Go to westonaprice.org and click on the Member Yet button and use the code POD10 for the discounted price just for podcast listeners. And while you're on the website, check out our many resources. If you haven't snagged it yet, order our free info pack that includes our most popular brochure, Timeless Principles of Healthy Traditional Diets. So again, go to westonaprice.org and click around. You're sure to find something that will benefit you and your family. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Darryl.
Hilda, it's great to be on your program today. Thanks for having me.
You are the Salt King, newly dubbed by me. And so I want to know, I can't believe you're promoting salt, because isn't salt bad for us? I've heard a lot of recommendations to lower our sodium intake. What's that all about?
That's a great question. We often hear that, salt's bad for us, but yet at the same time, we might go into the hospital and the first thing they do is they give us an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. So obviously salt's not the problem. It's the form that it's in and the food that it is on that becomes the problem.
Oh, that's a subtle distinction. Can you explain more?
Yeah, so the nature of salt changed. From the Weston A. Price Foundation, the idea of healthy, nutrient-dense foods and fermented foods, it goes hand in hand. And so, all of your listeners are probably aware of those things, but the nature of salt changed. And so if we went back before the invention of the refrigerator, all of us would have eaten more salt because we would have had more meats in salt to preserve the meats in our jerkies. We would have had more fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles. And so salt is necessary for food preservation. But around the turn of the century, we got the refrigerator. And so people started eating differently. And then the nature of salt also changed. And so if we look at salt in nature, salt occurs as a complex chloride. And so not only do we have sodium and chloride, which we have come to associate with table salt, but seawater occurs with potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, and then dozens of other elements and minerals in trace forms, things like iodine, zinc, selenium, phosphorus, manganese, and all of these other trace elements. And around the turn of the century, companies realized that they could take out some of these other minerals that occur in seawater.
Wait a minute. So why would they even bother to take them out? Couldn't they make table salt with those minerals in there?
They could, and that's the way it had always been done. One of the neat things about Weston A. Price, as you know, are the untold story of milk. And the nutrition, or the real value and the nutrition in milk, isn't the white liquid. It's actually the cream and the fats that are with that milk. And at one point, everybody bought milk as a whole product, and the fat and the cream and all of that was sold together. And then at some point, they realized that a farmer could take off the cream, which is the real nutritional, the nutrient dense part of milk, could sell that to another company to use for butter or for cream or for ice cream. And then they could still sell the leftover white part of milk and, in effect, really increase their revenue because they could sell them off separately. And salt companies kind of realized and started doing the same thing.
Oh my gosh, Darryl. Well, I had the feeling money was going to be the bottom line here because often when I do a deep dive to find out what's behind a change, somebody's looking at the financial bottom line.
Yeah, and it seemed to make logical sense at the time because I don't think people really thought through the ripple effects because we weren't looking at foods as holistic and we weren't, looking at, medicine being our food. But then these ripple effects, as you know, were pretty devastating.
Oh, absolutely. So, what happened next? Did the general population start to suffer from conditions that they wouldn't have had if they had more salt in their diet?
Yeah. So, after this change, we start seeing some diets linked to, or some studies linking salt to some problems. But there's another part of that story that we still haven't talked about yet. And so salt in nature is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means sucks water out of the air, kind of like a dehumidifier, so to speak. So if you take a salt crystal and put it on your countertop in a very humid day, the salt crystal actually sucks water out of the air. Now, this is important because in the body, we've talked about how salt is essential for life and why we get it in an IV in the hospital. But one of salt's primary functions in the body is to regulate moisture, and it regulates the intercellular and extracellular fluids. And so the way that nature has salt interacting with moisture is really critical. Unfortunately, what happens when you have salt and it's sucking water out of the air, the salt tends to clump and gets kind of sticky.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a lot of places, people will put maybe rice with their salt, or you'll have to tap the shaker a little bit to break up the salt crystals, and that's normal.
Yeah.
But around the same time, some salt companies got together and said, hey, what kind of chemicals can we add to salt to stop its ability to interact with moisture?
To stop it from clumping, basically.
Right. Yep. And so this campaign, they found several chemicals that they could add to salt that would coat the salt crystal and stop its ability to interact with moisture, which stops it from caking. The nice thing about that was you could have salt in a container on a rainy, humid day, and the salt will still pour out of the shaker. So the marketing tagline with the little girl and the umbrella that says, when it rains, it pours, was because when it rains outside and it's humid, the salt will still pour out of the shaker.
Oh my gosh, that's a huge aha. I had no idea what that slogan meant, when it rains, it pours. Like, okay, I had a little girl with an umbrella. Now I understand. Okay, go on.
Yeah, so it's kind of a fun look into history. And at the time, again, I don't think people thought anything of it. It was this great idea. We're trying to revolutionize and bring food to this higher level. But these ripple effects, just like pulling out the nutritional value of milk or pulling out these other trace minerals in salt, when we add this chemical that stops moisture to salt that's supposed to regulate moisture, it causes some problems. And so these chemicals are things like yellow prussiate of soda, which is sodium ferrous cyanide, or calcium silicoaluminate or sodium silicoaluminate. This is a similar antiperspirant, anti-moisture type chemical that we add to salt, or salt companies started to add to salt to stop it from clumping. The challenge, though, in trace amounts, it's probably okay. But I can guarantee if you and I took 2 licks of antiperspirant before breakfast, we're going to have some problems.
Oh, I would say so. And some of them would just be mental from the start, because why would we be doing that? But I get you. You're right. And this is the same thing that we see over and over again, right? In our food products, even in our cosmetics, that they say, oh, we've tested it and this small trace amount isn't going to hurt anybody. But it's the cumulative effect that can be detrimental.
Exactly. And so with those two issues, the demineralization of salt, it's like, we know that ascorbic acid is really good for us, and oranges and citrus have ascorbic acid. And if you were to take an orange and you sucked out all the vitamin C and ascorbic acid, and then you sold that to a supplement company, and then you sold the orange to the grocery store, you might not think anything of it at first, but when you stop to think about where the nutrition and the great part of the orange isn't the color, it's actually the citrus and the bioflavonoids and all of those things that make the orange special. And salt is the same way. So once we take out these other trace elements and we take out the complex chlorides, and then we add a bunch of chemicals that stop salt from doing what salt's supposed to do in the body. And then the third part is that, unfortunately, many foods today, if we're eating processed foods out of cans and boxes, there's high amounts of salt in those items. Salt is a natural preservative, and you can make food cheap, and you can make cheap food last longer by adding salt to it. But the salt they're adding to it is the demineralized and chemical version of salt. And so it's this trifecta of lack of minerals, a bunch of additives, and then the food that the salt is on is generally cheap and bad food. So if you go back to nature and you're eating fresh and you're intentionally going out of your way to find nutrient-dense food, then it becomes really important to go out of your way to add good, healthy salt, because you won't be getting all of that processed salt once you switch over to a more natural and healthy living food source.
Coming up, Darryl shares 3 questions to ask ourselves when we're getting started on sourcing good, healthy salt.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Chelsea Green Publishing. Chelsea Green Publishing is recognized as a leading publisher of books about restorative living, diet-focused, integrative health, organic farming, homesteading, local food, and more. Check out all the new recent and best-selling titles from Chelsea Green, including The Truth About COVID-19 by Dr. Joseph Mercola and Ronnie Cummins, Oneness versus the 1% by Vandana Shiva, and coming soon, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment by MIT scientist Stephanie Seneff. For more about these titles, visit chelseagreen.com. And as a special bonus for Wise Traditions listeners, receive 35% off your total order from Chelsea Green by using discount code POD35 at checkout. And please keep in mind that the Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported nonprofit. We keep going on your donations. You fuel our fire. So go to westonaprice.org/donate to give a gift of any size, or donate to us through PayPal directly to info@westonaprice.org. Thank you so much for your support, financial and otherwise. It really means a lot. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Well, you're just making me think that you're kind of preaching to the choir right now, because I think a lot of listeners here are doing just what you said. We're going out of our way to seek whole, real foods that are nutrient dense. And so we might as well do the same with our salt. So help us get started. If I wanted to find naturally mineralized salt, where would I begin?
That is a great question. I'm glad you asked. There's actually 3 questions that I tell people to ask. I'm a big fan of Redmond real salt that we harvest here in Utah, but there's a lot of other great salts on the market. And so as much as I would like to say, hey, use our salt, it's the best, I don't say that because there's a lot of other good products out there. But I think if you ask yourself these 3 questions, you'll end up with a healthy, great salt. And you can actually use those same 3 questions to find a great source of raw milk. You can ask it to find a great source of eggs or organ meat or whatever it is that you're basing your diet around. These 3 questions, I think, are universal. So the first one is, who's producing it? When it comes to salt, knowing the producer becomes a bit of a challenge, because you might walk into a grocery store or a big box store and just buy sea salt or a pink salt or something off the shelf, but it's really hard to know the face of the person that's producing it. And once you can find that person and know who that person is, it makes the second 2 questions a lot more easier. So the second question is, know the source. There's a lot of places you can get salt from. It can come from a current ocean, like the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Japan, the Mediterranean, Dead Sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel, or the Dead Sea here in Utah, or an ancient seabed. So those are the 3 potential places you can get salt from.
Okay, good. Okay, what's number 3?
The number 3 is, what's the process? So there's a lot of different things, as we just talked about, that people can do to salt or to anything. And so if you know who's producing it, you know the source, and you know the process, whether you're getting raw milk, eggs, cheese, kale, or natural salt, I think you'll find a lot better product.
That's really helpful. And I think it's funny. Well, I was just thinking about how we have bumper stickers that say, know your farmer. We could say, like, know your salt farmer, but that would be, as you said, harder to find. But we can identify the source and we can identify the process as we get closer to the source. And I'm glad you're mentioning this because actually, Darryl, I see a lot of salts for sale that look good on the outside, but I can't tell if they're the real deal. I've even heard there's like fake pink Himalayan salt. Is that possible?
Not fake. I think that would be a little bit harder. I think the challenge with the pink salts today is there's dozens, I've heard hundreds of mines that produce that product, and it just gets sent out largely from Pakistan to the coast. It's commingled and then shipped across to the US, resold and then repackaged. And so buying a pink salt, knowing which of those mines it came from, what processes they're using, what labor practices they're using, does become a bit of a challenge.
Well, the other thing is somebody told me they might be, like you said, commingling pink sea salt with regular sea salt because on the back of one of the little packages of salt my friend got recently, it had both labeled. It said pink sea salt and then it said sea salt. And she's like, I wonder if they're mixing it up.
Absolutely possible, because a lot of that salt, again, is just kind of dumped into a big general category, and then it's packaged and resold. And there are some great Himalayan pink salts, and there's a great pink salt that comes from Bolivia. It's called Bolivian pink or Bolivian rose. And then the real salt here in Utah, they're all geologically very similar. They're all ancient seabeds that scientists or geologists would say are 150 to 250 million year old seabeds. But again, because they get commingled and they ship so far, if you can know the source, knows who's producing it, it becomes a lot easier to know what processes they're using.
And let's talk about those processes now. What is the most natural process that you are aware of?
Well, if we go back to history, the ways that mankind always sourced salt was either from a current ocean. So you go to the coast of Brittany, France, seawater occurs at about 3% salt, and seawater can hold a maximum of 26% salt. And then the salt will fall out of suspension. And so the way humans have always gathered salt would be to take that seawater from the Mediterranean or wherever the coast is, pull the seawater in to a clay-lined pond, and then they line the pond with clay so the water just doesn't seep into the ground. And so by lining it with clay, it's a barrier. That clay was typically in the Mediterranean area, a gray clay. And so as the salt water evaporates and leaves salt crystals, it leaves the salt a light gray color because it's picking up the gray clays, which are rich in minerals in addition to the natural seawater. In Hawaii, they would do it the same way, but in Hawaii, the clay was a red clay pond. And so you get this Hawaiian red salt that has a kind of a dusty flavor. Really, both great products. The other way to do that is you watch animals, and animals will find their way to natural ancient seabeds, and they will paw or dig at the surface and find those minerals, those salt beds that are under the earth. And that's how the deposit in Utah was found, as well as the Bolivian and the Pakistan Himalayan deposits were found. We're just watching animals, humans watching animals and seeing them access the salt because salt's essential for life. The civilizations would start around access to those salt deposits. And then the other way today you can make salt is you use that same process. You pull the water out of the San Francisco Bay, but instead of leaving it all together, you use a different membrane that lines that pond, and then you can leach out the different chlorides based on what liner you have in that pond. And so rather than having that whole sea product, sea salt together, you can still sell it as sea salt because it starts at the sea, but you can still leach off those different minerals. And then the one other way is it's called solution mining. And you can take fresh water and pump it deep into the earth into a salt deposit from an ancient seabed, suck the water back out that now has salt with it, and then evaporate it at that point. When you do that, typically you would end up adding other chemicals to it, again, so the salt crystals don't clump.
And so if we really want to get to the bottom of how salt is processed by a company that we've come across or a producer, do we just like scour their website, or where is this data found? Because it sounds to me like you've, no pun intended, you've done some deep diving into this stuff.
I think it's just like any food source. Some companies are a lot more transparent and you can see and find the information you're looking for on their site. Oftentimes it's hard just by looking at a label because some labels are not as, you don't have a lot of room and it's not as detailed as maybe we would like as a consumer. And so, yeah, if you can't find the answers online, just picking up the phone, calling the salt company, calling the dairy or calling the farmer and say, hey, I'm interested in your products. Can you tell me a little bit more? What soil is this grown in? What chemicals are you using in the process? What heat and processes are being used? And I think just being a little more conscious and aware and a little more engaged in our food, we will end up with a lot higher, more nutrient dense food choices.
Yeah. And there might be some people saying, oh, that's going too far. I would never call the salt company. But let me tell you this. Having conversed with Sally Fallon Morell and other experts on the show, including yourself, obviously, I am well aware of how important salt is for our diet. We got one testimonial recently from a young man who said he was really depressed. And when he started adding real mineralized, naturally mineralized salt into his diet, his depression lifted. And I'm not saying it's a cure all, but the point is for healthy brain function and hormonal function, we need salt.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the human body and the human process, we're visiting here today in the absence outside of a spiritual discussion of us visiting here 1 minute and being dead the next minute. Outside of a spiritual discussion, the real difference is the absence of an electric current. And my hand moves because an electric current passes through from my mind down to my hand to tell my fingers to move. And our bodies have to conduct electricity, and salt is an electrolyte. And so because it conducts electricity. And so if our salt levels drop, all kinds of bad things start happening. Depression, nausea, being ornery. We know how important, we talk a lot about hydration and how important it is to drink water. But if you don't have salt with the water that you're drinking, you're flushing all of those electrolytes. If you've ever tasted your tears, they're salty. If you've tasted your sweat from your arms, it's salty. And I wouldn't recommend it, but if you tasted your urine, it will be salty. And so we are flushing salts all of the time through our bodies because salt is so essential. And so when those salt levels drop, because we're working, we're exercising, we're sweating, we're eating great clean foods, but we're not adding the natural mineral salt, our digestion starts to go, our sleep ability starts to go, our headaches. There's all kinds of problems that start to creep in when our salt levels are too low. And eventually we can even die because of hyponatremia, which is low salt.
Wow, my mind is just blown when I think about how important it is to our bodies. And actually, I know that the word salary, for example, the root of it is salt. People used to be paid in salt, didn't they?
They did in the times of Rome because salt was so essential for life. They were paid a salary. The Roman soldiers were paid a salary or paid in salt because they could use it universally to trade. The old saying, is a man worth his salt, comes from the same idea. If you're getting paid in salt and you're not earning your keep, you're not working hard enough, then you would say this, is this man worth his salt because he's getting paid and he's not, really working hard enough to justify his salary.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. A little word, what's it called? Breakdown. What do they call that? Etymology or something?
Right.
Anyway, Darryl, this is great. And I want to ask you about one more element, iodine. We know it's good for us. I've interviewed some folks who say it's really critical for our health. What about iodized salt?
Iodine next to salt is so important, and no discussion on salt without iodine would be amiss. But if we back up and let's see. So any discussion on salt without iodine would be amiss because iodine is so essential for life. As you point out, most of your listeners today, including you and I, are probably a little bit iodine deficient because it's such an important nutrient. But salt and iodine weren't always tied together. The reason that we think about those elements together is because around World War I, the U.S. was drafting men from the Midwest, from all over, but in the Midwest particularly, they noticed that there was an iodine deficiency causing a goiter problem in the Midwest. Now, keep in mind, about this time, people are eating a lot of processed foods in the Midwest. They don't have access to good sources of fresh seafood and seaweed, which are rich in natural iodine. And so the government got together and said, hey, we need to find a way to stop this goiter problem because we can't draft men in the military if they have goiter. And so I would hope at this discussion, these bright minds of the world said, hey, why don't we have a campaign that says, eat more iodine or eat foods rich in iodine. Let's eat more kelp and more seaweed and more fish and more dulse and these natural, even mozzarella cheese and these other natural foods that are rich in iodine. That didn't happen, or if it did, that's not where they ended. What they ended on was trying to find a food source that they could put processed iodine with to force more iodine consumption, similar to how in some municipalities today, fluoride is added to water supplies to encourage or to force people to eat fluoride. And so what they found was they tried to add iodine to different things people always ate. So they tried to add it to flour. I would assume they looked into water. I don't know for sure. What they ended up on was salt, because they could take iodine, potassium iodide specifically, they could add it to salt and it was shelf stable. And because people have to eat salt to live, if they force or put potassium iodide with salt, it in effect forces people to eat more iodine. And it actually worked. It did solve the problem. People started eating more iodine. The challenge, though, is that when you take potassium iodide and add it to salt, it's less than 10% bioavailable. So iodine is really essential for life. But when you put it with salt, it's a very poor nutrient version of iodine. And so I encourage everybody to seek out great foods rich in iodine. But iodized salt is a really poor way to get iodine.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that, because I was wondering about that. And let me ask you, if real salt is what we need to be adding to our diet, how much do you recommend per day?
So there's a couple of great books. One of my favorites, it's from several years ago, but the book is called Your Body's Many Cries for Water, written by a Dr. Batmangeli. And Dr. Batmangeli said that we should salt our food liberally, assuming you're eating natural, clean, unprocessed foods. And then for every quart of water that we drink, we should add a quarter teaspoon of salt to that quart of water. Because again, most of us probably aren't drinking enough water. People are drinking too much other stuff, but not water. So as you drink enough water, which in his book, he suggests at least half your body weight in ounces. And some professionals think that might be too little or too much. But using his half your body weight in ounces, if I weigh 150 pounds, I should be drinking about 75 ounces, roughly 3 quarts, give or take, of good, clean, natural water, and adding a quarter teaspoon of salt to offset that water to give us that great mineral electrolyte balance in our body. So I think that's a really good place to start. And then not being afraid of salting our food liberally. As we listen to our bodies talk, our bodies crave things, right? It craves water when we're thirsty. It craves salt when we're low on salt. Now, because of the way the SAD diet or the standard American diet, and so as people are eating better, natural, clean foods, their level of salt actually drops. And so as we talked earlier in the podcast, how important salt levels are in the body, we need to go out of our way to add great healthy salt, great healthy food. And if we listen to our bodies talk, we can find those better food sources. Unfortunately, sometimes we think we're craving sugar or we're craving potato chips. What we're really craving is salt. So what I recommend doing is putting a little dish of natural mineral salt with what I recommend is putting a natural mineral salt on your countertop with the larger peppercorn-sized crystals of salt. And as you walk past, if you have a food craving, if you think you're craving sugar or processed foods, just put one of those little salt crystals under your tongue. And most people realize that satisfies a lot of those cravings.
Wow, that is great advice. I know our listeners are going to love it. I do. So, Darryl, let me ask you as we start to wrap up, and you may have already answered this question along the way, but if you could give the listener one piece of advice, one thing they could do to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I love that question. And I think for me, what I've found is trying to live intentionally. Sometimes we'll set big, audacious goals and it just seems overwhelming. But I think just having an awareness or trying to live more intentionally then accomplishes the small parts of those goals. And so if I just try to, live intentionally and seek out better foods, rather than having all this list of do's and don'ts, I find that my mind and my body and my preferences and the way I look at life starts to change. And so I had one piece of advice. It would be just that, to try to live intentionally and then see where it takes you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation, Darryl. I really enjoyed it.
Hilda, thanks for having me on your program today.
Our guest today was Darryl Bosshardt. Visit his website, redmond.life. And I'm Hilda Labrada Gore. You can find me at holistichilda.com. For the transcript for this and every podcast episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org. And now for a review from Apple Podcasts. Fantastic podcast from Jennifer Carrillo. I used to think Weston A. Price Foundation was only about food, LOL. A new devotee and member of the Weston A. Price Foundation since last year, I find myself loving this podcast more and more. You are spot on when it comes to health, wellness, nutrition, medicine, and medical freedom. I feel so connected to you. Thank you for covering so thoroughly such a wide range of topics that holistically support true health. I am inspired and encouraged on a weekly basis and hope more people will tune in to this absolute gem of a podcast. Jennifer, thank you for your glowing review. It means so much. If you'd like to, you can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Just click on the ratings and reviews and give us 5 stars and tell us what you think of the show. Thanks so much for listening, my friends. Stay well. Hasta pronto.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.